been a while since I last made a video covering PUBG map design, and part of that was because I wanted to experience Sanhok from its earliest stages to where it is now. And I gotta say that Sanhok is just the kind of map PUBG really needed next. Fast-paced action, loads of good loot everywhere, and a great mix of land and water battles is a stark contrast to the pace of previous maps, and I just want to give a sincere thank you to the devs behind this map for listening to the player base and making changes during its development. It certainly worked out for the better, in my opinion. It's what I want to talk about in this video now that I feel like the map has been out for long enough, as well as what I hope PUBG's future maps take from Sanhok design-wise. There's also a few other mechanical PUBG things that I feel needed addressed in the video, so I'll be discussing that near the end. Anyways, let's just get on to it. Interesting hot drops and building layout balance. I was never really a fan of hot dropping on either of the past two maps, especially Miramar. My number one issue was always trying to find an adequate weapon as soon as I landed, which usually means either an AR, DMR, or SMG. Shotguns can work sometimes, but it's usually a roll of the dice when it comes to hitting a target with a full shot that downed or killed them, or just hitting their arms with 4 or 5 pellets and subsequently getting mowed down by whatever gun they were more fortunate to find. And pistols, well, yeah, you can use them sometimes, I guess. Now, I'm not trying to say that Sanhok doesn't necessarily fix this issue, but I do think it helps greatly alleviate it in a lot of ways. Firstly, there are loads of decent loot all over the place, and the up spawn rate of most automatic weapons on this map certainly helps with finding a gun that you can reliably defend yourself with. Secondly, the layouts of these areas strike a very nice balance between not being too open while not being too congested either, with the exception of ruins, because apparently every new map needs some variation of school. Seriously, I'll never understand the appeal to these places coming from someone who primarily plays squads and hates losing a member early on, but I can see why people might drop here in solos for quick and easy fights, where usually the first one to a gun beats out everyone else. That's not how it will always go, but that's usually what happens to me. Looking at other common hot drops like Paradise, Boot Camp, and Camps Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, it's a blast to fight in these areas. In a dev video discussing the design behind these locations, they stated that they wanted to keep structures overall simple, so that layouts of buildings would be easier to remember while also making them more difficult to effectively camp in, which is a problem that I never liked on the previous maps. On Erangel, the teams within a compound in the final circles are almost always the ones to make it to the end, mostly because a team in the open is always limited not just in movement, but also in the places that they can peek from. There's a lot more windows on Erangel's buildings, which makes it that much more difficult for an advancing team to gain any ground when a building peeker can easily change their location in a few seconds. Miramar tried to fix this with some of the buildings having boarded up windows, sometimes with very little success, but with Miramar, it's usually the number of rooms that makes me anxious to push into another team's building. Sound is a very strong advantage in a building defender's arsenal, especially in buildings with multiple floors and rooms, and sometimes the person entering may just walk right past your room and bam, easy kill. There's certainly smarter ways to handle these buildings on Miramar, but if a final circle ends in a big city, it's going to be rough trying to effectively push buildings unless you have really good gear. Comparatively, Sanhok's common wooden huts still can be effective means for cover, but they do also have their blind spots, so having a team all stay in one building and watch all the windows isn't nearly as effective as it is on Erangel. And because of their simple open rooms and few hiding places, pushing into a hut doesn't feel nearly as daunting as Miramar's cluttered and taller structures. Coupled with the fact that Sanhok's hilly terrain offers overall more trees and rocks than Erangel or Miramar, and I would say that sometimes a building or compound can be a really ineffective place to hold a final circle at times. For me personally, Sanhok's structures, hot drops, and even the towns offer a lot more depth and complexity when compared to previous maps, and part of that is due to how straightforward the building's layouts are, as well as the spacing between them and terrain that's around them. I really hope that future PUBG maps follow these building designs because I think that they're at their best with Sanhok, and it's by far the strongest aspect that stuck out to me. Map size, zone speed, terrain, and player movement. Map size is a pretty easy one to discuss, as I think most people understand that Sanhok's pace is much quicker than the previous maps, so I won't go too far into that. A map the quarter of the size with the same 100 players means that there will inevitably be more frequent encounters, coupled with the fact that Sanhok shares a similar 50-50 land to water ratio like Erangel, with Sanhok actually having slightly more water this time around. Land versus water ratio is a key point that I talked about in depth in my last video, so you can watch that if you want to hear more about my thoughts on this. The terrain on Sanhok takes pages out of both Erangel's and Miramar's books with how it feels and plays. It definitely feels like a jungle, and there's many different high-rolling hills, trees, rocks, bushes, etc. that can be used for cover and flanking, which plays a huge role in gunfights. Water vehicles also see some more prominence with the inclusion of rivers, and even a guaranteed jet ski spawn in the cave to supplement this. Land vehicles can also be used, but I definitely think they're less effective, if not more risky to use unless you don't have any other options. They give away your position to nearly everyone on the map, as well as being hard to navigate off-road due to the amount of trees and rocks. They're not impossible to use, but I think the 2-seater bike is the only one really suited for this map's environment. That being said though, the 4-seaters can cross some cleverly placed land bridges that allows players to not have to swim across to another island, but it does still leave them incredibly exposed. Given the fact that the zone moves slower in the endgame circles, as well as the map's size and terrain, land vehicles only really serve as means to quickly move to the next circle early on rather than later in the game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just different compared to the previous maps. I'm interested in how this map will play in the pro scene, given that Sanhok will undoubtedly lead to more action early on than the usual meta of teams having to loot up in the first 10 minutes and avoid early engagements. Visuals and atmosphere. I don't have much to say regarding how the map looks from an overall perspective. It's definitely got some interesting details in places and the environment feels believable enough. I love the inclusion of areas like the docks and the cave that help to not only make Sanhok look more unique, but also play differently as well. That's all I feel really needs to be covered in the visual department, so what do I mean by atmosphere? Well, I'm mostly referring to the dynamic weather feature included in Sanhok, and it works incredibly well. Rain and fog both make their returns in the form of random occurrences lasting for about 5 to 8 minutes at a time, and I think they really help add even more character to Sanhok. Rain is a fitting weather type for a jungle, and I can't help but be even more involved in a match when it starts raining, especially near the end of the game in those tense moments before encountering another player. And the way that fog returns is also interesting for an already CQC style map, with far off areas starting to gradually build in fog until you can't see very far at all, to where it may slowly dissipate in the same manner it appeared. Both of these are really awesome touches to the map, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see dynamic weather introduced into Erangel or Miramar as well in the near future. Quality of life improvements, and the future for PUBG. Like I mentioned early in the video, I also wanted to talk about some minor features that I hope are added in sooner rather than later, as well as what I hope to see for the future of PUBG content and improvements. One improvement that I hope to see soon is having some form of input queues or input buffering. This is something that nearly any fighting game or first-person shooter has as standard, and I can explain it simply with an example. Let's say you're reloading your gun in CSGO, and you want to immediately start firing after the reload animation finishes. All you would need to do is simply hold left click near or during the animation, and you'll immediately start firing the moment it's finished. Looking at PUBG, however, if you press left click just a little too early and hold it, your character won't do anything. It's a very subtle mechanic, but it's what can sometimes mean life or death in a competitive setting, and it's surprising to me that PUBG still doesn't have something like this. Other improvements that I'd like to see are more advanced graphics options, such as a slider for image sharpening, drawing on the map for better squad and duos planning, seeing your own kills and knocks in the kill feed, viewing your ping, an offline practice mode or firing range, etc, etc, etc. Alongside the game's desperate need for better networking and optimizations overall right now. Final thoughts. I want to end this video by saying that I love playing PUBG, and that all the criticism it gets by the players who've dealt with the issues is completely justified in my view, especially after seeing the recent event pass that was released alongside Sanhok. While my opinions on the map won't change, it doesn't help make it look that great when there's a clear money-making scheme associated with it, not to mention that some of its missions didn't even work properly in the first week or so. The fact that you could also buy 5-level increments just feels wrong to me. It completely invalidates the point to doing missions and playing the game for XP to level up in the first place. Anyway, I don't really need to talk too much about the pass. It's pretty clear at this point that most people disliked it, so here's hoping that if they do another, it'll offer better missions and more unlockable content for a longer period of time, while getting rid of XP caps and temporary items. One final thing I want to mention, and this is coming from me personally, is that I really want to see some form of modding in this game, even if it's only just a level editor. If it wasn't already apparent, I love analyzing FPS maps, and I've made my share of CSGO levels in the past as well. PUBG has huge amounts of potential for custom map ideas, and versus the rest of its competition, I feel like it's the only one that may ever introduce modding to the PC player base, and it could potentially revitalize it somewhat if most just jump ship to a similar game. Of course, a wish like this comes second to having core fixes and optimizations first, but it's something that I'd like to see at some point in this game's lifespan. And so that's pretty much it. What are your guys' thoughts about Sanhok? Love it or hate it, and why? Leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and that's all from me. See ya.